Welcome back. It's your boy DG from DG Mindset. I've been waiting for this episode, and you have too. Before we get started, make sure you subscribe, make sure you hit like, and make sure you put in the comments what you want to know more about. People ask me daily, what do I have to do to get rid of my ego? Why is the ego so bad? What is the ego? This episode, we're going to break down truly what the ego is. So let's understand this. We live on three different planes of existence: the spiritual plane, the mental plane, the physical plane. Spirit, mind, body. Awareness, thoughts, your physical life. So you're operating on three different planes at the same time. The causal plane, the first one, is the spiritual plane. We call this spirit. We call this consciousness. We call this being. We call this essence. There's a myriad of words that we refer to as the non-physical part of you, the real you, the awareness. Every time that you say I, this was what was supposed to be saying it. This was the awareness of everything. If I look at this camera right now, I am aware of this camera. Because I am observing it, I know that I am not the camera. So this is what's observing your thoughts. This is what's observing your body. This is why I've told you, you're not your body and you're not your thoughts. You are simply observing it. This is where meditation came in. Meditation was really powerful because it allowed you to turn inward, and now you could see that you were actually the observer. So you are the thing that exists outside of space and time. But because you are in this physical incarnation and you do have a physical body, you needed something to create an identity within this physical 3D matrix. This is where the ego came in. So I'm gonna give you a couple things, a couple characteristics of the ego so you can understand how it works. Number one, the ego only exists in the negative polarity because of your unawareness of it. People say, well, I don't have an ego. We all have an ego. Everyone has an ego. The ego was needed for us to have a physical life because the ego is what was used so the physical body, our personal reality or our personality, would have things to identify itself with, because what we were was the awareness behind it all. So the ego lives in this thing called duality. It either has to be above someone else or below someone else. So every time that you compare yourself to somebody, this is the ego. Every time that you think that you are less than somebody, this is the ego. Every time that you think that you are better than somebody, this is the ego. The spirit consciousness already knows that it is equal and it is the same thing. Think of it like this. Spirit is unity. Ego is duality. The moment that we introduce duality, now we're creating this thing called separation. And that is the complete opposite of unity. We have Republican, we have Democrat. We have gay, we have straight. We have Christian, we have Buddhism. We have all of these things that the moment we introduce two, it creates separation. Good, bad. But we know through the universal law of the law of polarity that one energy just has two sides. So we have hot and we have cold. And we may say, well, hot is good and cold is bad. No, they're both the same energy. They're on the same line, just on different poles. The ego creates this illusion that hot is over here and cold is over here and that they're separate. But in reality, they were the same thing. So when we look at something as being good and we look at something as being bad, realize that they're both the same energy. The only difference between the two was your perspective of it. The ego, though, makes you think, well, good is good and bad is bad. Right is right and wrong is wrong. There was no difference between the two other than your perspective of it. They were both the one thing. So this is what the ego does. It creates duality. Why? So it can create suffering. And here's why it creates suffering. It's competing against something, your consciousness, spirit, that is infinite. Spirit is always present. It always will be. It always has been. The ego, though, is attached to your physical body, the physical world. Well, we know that this thing called death, once the physical body is done, the ego is gone. And now, what does it do in your life? It creates attachment to all these physical things so it can make you think that these things are infinite, that they are real. So every time that you have an attachment to something, that's the ego. Why? Because the moment that you don't have that thing, it induces suffering. And the ego sits in the background like this. Good. She's suffering because he left. That means that we're alive if she's suffering. So which brings me to my next point. The ego is rooted in survival. Survival. So when you're living in fear, that's survival. When you live in worry, That's you trying to survive. Stress, survival. Anxiety, survival. The key was to be in the moment, to be present. This was the only place that the ego could not live. The ego can only live in the past, in the future. It cannot live in the present moment. So this was why it was always so important for you to breathe. Because every time that you breathe, you were being present. Do you see how this works? If we even look at the word spirit, spirit comes from the Latin word spirare, which means breath. Breathing consciously brings you back to the present moment. And in the present moment, the ego has nowhere to go. And this is where you would feel your peace. Breath is life. What was the first thing that you did when you were born? Doctor smacked you on your butt. So you would take a breath. What's the last thing we do when we're living? Right before we cross over and we die. We take our last breath. So connecting with your breath will bring you back to the present moment, and this is where the ego cannot reside. So if you have any suffering in your life, whether you're living in the past because you're living from regret or shame or guilt, or maybe you're living in the future of you get worried or you feel stress or you feel fear or anxiety, let that be a signal to let you know that you're living in unawareness through the ego. The ego's not the enemy, because the ego was the tool to show us what part of us needed to be healed, needed to be reconciled. So if I still struggle with trauma that happened in the past, that's the ego that's keeping that narrative going. But the reason why is because it's trying to let me know I need to go back and heal this. I need to go back and deal with this. And when I go back to that and I reconcile that, I literally bring that energy from the past and integrate it into the present moment. And now the ego can no longer live in that unawareness. I have become aware of what the problem is. So really, the universe gave us an ego as a built-in mechanism to help us to become more aware of ourselves. And at the end of the day, that's what the ancients were always teaching us. That's what our ancestors were striving for, was to become more aware of self. Self was the spirit, the real you, the infinite you. The ego, though, wanted you to think that you were this finite thing that was attached to this body. So this is why you don't have to have a fear of death, because that what actually dies wasn't actually the real part of you. The real part of you never dies. It's omnipresent. It will always exist. So hopefully, you're starting to see that the ego's not the enemy, but the ego induces suffering, not in the bad sense, but it's a way for you, the I am, to increase its awareness of itself. So here's how we use the ego as a tool instead of the ego using us as a tool. Ask yourself, when you have these lower energies, these lower vibrations, ask yourself, what is this situation trying to show me? What is this situation trying to teach me? And if I could go back, what would I do differently? Just by doing that, you've increased your awareness. And as we increase our awareness, now the ego and the negative polarity can't run itself wild in our lives. If this video resonated with you and you want to find out more, you want to know about a part 2, go ahead and leave it in the comments, because we can dive as deep as you want to, so you can start living the life that you've been destined to live. As always, thank you for joining me. If this video resonates with you, send it off to somebody else. Make sure you hit subscribe. Make sure they hit like and subscribe. And until next time, be good.